Nothing that's happened in F1 testing has dented Red Bull's status as pre-season favourite in 2023. It set an ominous pace over the 3 days in Bahrain and once again looks like the car to beat. What testing has done is prove that main rivals Ferrari, which looked quick over a lap but struggled more over long runs, and Mercedes, which battled balance problems, are determined to go their own way with their cars. Other than Mercedes and Ferrari, almost every team in F1 has edged more in the direction of Red Bull's concept, save for Haas, which is locked into a more Ferrari-esque style owing to their shared components. That's because Red Bull is F1's most successful car, and presumably because those teams have evaluated Red Bull's ideas back at their factories and seen enough to make them believe it's the right way to go for these still young ground effect regulations. So why are Mercedes and Ferrari so convinced that their alternative approaches are going to work? Just how different are the three cars, and is there any chance that Red Bull might not be on the right track for the long term? Red Bull has done what most other teams have done and followed the path set by its championship-winning 2022 car, the RB18. That's most obviously characterised by the aggressively undercut side pods with the pronounced downwash ramps that channel airflow into the Coke bottle area at the rear of the car. Ferrari is at the other end of the scale with its side pods featuring an undercut shape that is less pronounced. The top surface doesn't drop away dramatically and instead channels air to the beam wing at the rear. The beam wings also vary across all three cars. Red Bull has the most aggressive design, Mercedes the least, and Ferrari is somewhere in between. Mercedes has edged a little away from its extreme zero side pods concept, as you can see in this image comparing the W14 to its predecessor, but it still has a more narrow design than Red Bull. There is also some downwash in evidence, but it's not as aggressive as what Red Bull does. But this is not just about the side pods, as even within the most prescriptive regulations in F1 history, there are visible differences everywhere. The nose structures vary, the way they shape the front wing flaps, and even the end plates differ. For example, Mercedes has its distinctive design that uses a clever interpretation of the rules to create a little outwash cutout. Red Bull has opted for pull rod suspension at the front for aerodynamic and packaging reasons, whereas Mercedes and Ferrari both have a push rod configuration. At the rear, it's the other way around, with Red Bull running push rod and Mercedes and Ferrari have pull rods. Also take a look at the air intakes for the very differently shaped air boxes and the three different engines. Red Bull's is rounded, Ferrari's triangular, and Mercedes slightly squarer. Likewise, there are differences in the shape of the engine cover thanks to the differences in the power unit and cooling packaging. As for the crucial floor edges, all three teams have different treatments, proving that there is no one-size-fits-all solution. What we can't see is their treatment of the crucial underfloors, save for the variation in the fences at the front of them. And this is the crucial performance driver of the car. But of course, it's the way all of these design features work together that defines a car's performance. You couldn't just stick a Red Bull side pod onto a Mercedes and expect it to work without changing all of the other parts that interact with it. There are countless other ways the Ferrari and Mercedes differ from the Red Bull, but this quick overview of the most obvious areas shows you how different the cars can be even under these tight regulations. But if you compare the other cars on the grid to the big three, most would have far more similarities to the Red Bull than the rest. So the key question is, why do Ferrari and Mercedes believe their direction is better than that taken by the team that won 17 out of 22 races last year and seems to have led the way during pre-season testing? For all the talk of differences between car concepts, Red Bull, Mercedes and Ferrari are all trying to do the same thing to extract performance. It's about maximising the downforce produced by the powerful ground effect Venturi tunnels underneath the car. Crucial to that is not only the unseen aero design beneath the floor, but also the way you condition the airflow that's delivered to the front of the floor and the side pods. Picking out differences in various geometries is one thing, but it's essential to remember that the aero map of an F1 car is more than just the sum of its parts. It's about how everything works together, the interaction of countless individual airflows and vortices, all impacted by the constant changes in the attitude of the car and the prevailing conditions. This is hugely complex. That's why, despite the attention on its very obviously distinctive side pods last year, Mercedes has always been adamant that this was not the cause of its problems. As Mercedes technical director Mike Elliott told the race last year, if you were to swap side pod concept, I don't think it makes a big difference to where we're at. F1 car design is all about deciding on your compromises and, in aerodynamic terms, deciding how you're going to use and manipulate the available airflow to best effect. That's where there are continuing question marks over the Mercedes design. As our very own technical expert at the race, ex-F1 car designer Gary Anderson has suggested, while the narrow side pods allow efficient passage of the airflow down the side of the car to the rear end, the lack of pronounced undercut means it can't realign the airflow for optimum effect. It may be that all three concepts can yield the same performance, and perhaps over time, as Ferrari and Mercedes make more progress, we'll start to see that. For year 2 of these regulations, Ferrari and Mercedes have stuck with their guns in terms of concept. Their belief, or perhaps that should be hope, is that there is a higher performance ceiling by going down a different route to Red Bull. If they weren't convinced by the potential of their designs versus the Red Bull concept, they wouldn't persist with them just to be stubborn. This is a results business, and if following Red Bull's cues felt like a better route to success, Ferrari and Mercedes would be taking it. One of the problems with copying another car is that unless you spot something the originator of that design hasn't, you're always going to be playing catch-up. So Ferrari and Mercedes will be concerned that they'd always be at least one step behind if they went down the Red Bull route. Plus, as we mentioned earlier, changing one part, for example the front wing, floor, side pods or the diffuser, would require so many other parts of the car to be changed to work with that new addition. It's not simple, it would mean pretty much starting over. This is where the situation differs for Red Bull's direct rivals compared to the midfield teams who have been more willing to follow the lead from the champions. Right now, an Aston Martin, McLaren or Alfa Romeo isn't trying to beat Red Bull, it just wants to close the gap and get ahead of its direct rivals in a tightly contested pack. And copying some ideas from Red Bull is likely to be a faster way to make that progress than persisting with their own routes that haven't yielded much success so far. For Mercedes in particular, which stands alone with its design since Williams ditched its narrow side pods last year, sticking to its guns is a gamble that could backfire, especially with concerns about the balance of the car emerging during testing, which will have the leading midfield teams licking their lips. Aston Martin technical director Dan Fallows, who joined that team last April, having worked for Red Bull since 2006, has overseen a car with clear design cues taken from the 2022 Red Bull. That continues a process that started with last year's Spanish Grand Prix upgrade. Then, Aston Martin dropped its original sidepod concept, which proved horrendously problematic. This was replaced by a take on the Red Bull design, featuring the pronounced downwash ramps at the rear of the sidepod, although Aston Martin claimed it had been working on this design before it had seen the RB18. The Aston Martin AMR 23 has now gone even more in the Red Bull direction, and as Fallows has pointed out, this is one of the two very obvious development routes aerodynamically. Presumably he considers Ferrari to be the other one, which leads to what he called a certain amount of convergence on that philosophy. Aston Martin has a few tricks of its own that it's brought to the car. Some of those, Fallows says, are still hidden, but you can see obvious areas such as its front wing, which is more aggressively loaded outboard than its rivals. There are also Ferrari design cues, with a hint of that in the top surface of Aston Martin's side pods and the aggressive gully that feeds airflow to the rear. So while it's primarily going down the Red Bull route, there's more to it than that. With so many in the midfield pack also going in the Red Bull direction, it poses a tantalising question. If Red Bull's approach is definitively better than that of Ferrari and Mercedes, does that mean the leading midfielders could threaten them? The consensus is that Aston Martin is the standout midfielder from testing, with Alfa Romeo looking handy, Alpine keeping its powder dry but quietly confident, and McLaren struggling. If Aston Martin and Fernando Alonso can lead that midfield pack, perhaps its approach of producing a Red Bull-esque car that also takes a few ideas from Ferrari could allow it to punch above its weight and cause problems for the big three, or at the very least, Mercedes.